Building governance from the ground up at early stage companies is Jack Lazar's specialty and his favorite kind of challenge. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. In this episode, Lazar, the 2025 NACD Directorship 100 Private Company Director of the Year, and a director at Astera Labs, Box, Global Foundries, Residio Technologies, and Tonal Systems, and NACD advisor Susan Paley explore Lazar's extensive Silicon Valley career. They also discuss the nuances of private company board service, what it takes to work with visionary founders, and why effective governance always comes back to people and relationships. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Jack Lazar, when someone wanders onto LinkedIn and checks your profile, they check out your experience in Silicon Valley and they might think, geez, why don't you tell us what functions you haven't led and what leadership roles you haven't had? That list might be shorter. So in your words, give us a brief summary, if you would, of your extensive experience.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I really do believe that podcasts like this are very important, especially for people just coming up in their career of being a board member and kind of learning, just like I had to learn as I started down this path. I can tell you right now that you really shouldn't have me run engineering. I can kind of play an engineer on TV, but probably shouldn't be doing that. But I have been pretty involved in most functions in a company. And I think that's a function of working in a lot of growth startup companies and some larger companies. But really, the growth companies give you a lot of opportunities to spread your wings and try different things. Probably the most important decision I made was coming to college up here in the Bay Area. And I went to Santa Clara University. And the reason it was important was I had no idea that we were really heading into probably the biggest economic boom in the history of mankind, with technology growing the way in which it has up here in the Bay Area. So I was fortunate enough when I graduated, I worked in public accounting for a few years to kind of get my foundation for business. No intent of ever staying in public accounting. And I went to a startup, a company called Electronics for Imaging. And we invented something that seems very, everybody has it today, which is short run color printing. You used to not be able to print in color unless you went to a big print press. Ends up, that was a really fast growing company. And I came in as the budget guy, eventually grew into being the controller, and then turned into the acting CFO when I was 29 years old. And that's kind of the experience you get in these fast growing startups. Is I got elevated to a position I probably shouldn't have been in at a very young age. And so I've been a CFO really since I was 29 years old. I did a variety of startups. I did a really bad network management company in the mid 90s that we were able to sell for probably more than it was worth. And then I did a .com company called Net Ratings, which we literally took public in December of 1999 when anything could go public. Post that, I actually took some time off, which I highly recommend as you're going through your career. And I ended up at a company called Atheros Communications, which was the longest company that I was at. I was there for about 10 years and it was just fantastic. It was a great place to be. I was very, very fortunate to have been able to do that early in my career. And I worked with a CEO who was someone I'd still be working with today if we hadn't sold the company to Qualcomm. We grew it to be $1 billion plus company. At the time when we sold it, it was the largest fabless to fabless semiconductor deal ever done. It was $3.5 billion. It's a lot less than the deals get done now, but it was a big deal. I worked in Qualcomm for a while, so I've worked in big companies. And then I took another break and I was the CFO of GoPro during the time in which we took it public in 2014. Quite honestly, I was just very lucky to be at some really great companies. And then I decided at some point that, I've been sitting in boardrooms for a long time, that governance was something that was interesting to me and it could be a next leg of my career. And over all those companies, I ended up doing operations roles, finance roles, pretty much anything in admin, sales and marketing, sales operations. I have been very blessed to have a lot of interesting places to really spread my wings.
You mentioned the importance of moving to Northern California early in your career for college, and Silicon Valley has a very distinct culture that we all know of throughout the country as being particularly very entrepreneurial and highly visionary. So I'm curious, what lessons have you learned about how to work with those kinds of leaders?
I personally love working with founders. It's a very different trait that you get from some of these people. These are some of the most dedicated people that you can imagine to what they're doing. And just wonderfully open, if you pick the right founders, to getting advice from each other or from other people. I think what I love about this place is that passion and the creativity, because it just gives you a lot of energy, right? It inspires you to go to work. Work isn't work. Work is fun here if you're doing the right thing. And what I found in dealing with these folks that's really fascinating is they're all brilliant. They're these people who come from Stanford and Berkeley and MIT, and they got PhDs, and they're just wonderfully smart people. But sometimes they get a little too hooked on the technology and not enough on the business models. And that's where I can kind of add value, is the business model side of things. And so I found that, it's kind of a hand in glove type relationship. I try to understand what they're doing. And at the same time, I teach them, to the extent I can help, I try to teach them about the importance of the business models, because there's just a lot of technology out there that never really comes to be a real business because it doesn't have the right business model. And I think that's probably the thing I've learned where I can add the most value in a company.
Let's look at your board service. As you know, our audience is tuned into serving on boards or aspiring to that role. And I'm just curious about how you found your first board opportunity. And you probably get several opportunities a year, I would think, given your position, and how you judge whether to say yes or no to a certain board opportunity.
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into my first board opportunity. It's kind of interesting how it evolved. And, at the time I was working at Qualcomm, and Qualcomm really didn't encourage people to be on boards. But I got a call from a friend of mine who I'd literally met this guy when he tried to sell me a business when I was at Atheros, and we weren't able to pull off the transaction. But he had risen up to become the CEO of a company called Silicon Labs in Austin. And he was a first-time CEO. He called me up and said, "Hey, I'm looking for a board member. And I think you might be the right person to do this, because I'm looking for a finance person who's in Silicon Valley, who's, recent member of a management team. And you kind of fit that. And I know you, and would you consider doing this?" And quite honestly, I'd never really thought about doing it. But I was at this point in my career where I was trying to evaluate what I wanted to do next. So I thought, well, I know this guy. I know their business, actually. Why not give it a shot? So I went down, interviewed with the board in Austin, met a wonderful set of people who had basically been the board members since the beginning of the company. They were kind of transitioning into the next phase of the company, with a new CEO, and they were going to turn over some of the board. We just kind of hit it off, and I felt like I could add value, so I decided to do it. And it was really interesting because I didn't necessarily know what I was doing when I went down this path. I've been sitting in boardrooms for a long time, but I didn't really understand all of what a board did. And so I went into education mode. That's how I got originally exposed to NACD. I took classes. I just figured I need to learn, right? And then I would go to these board meetings, and one piece of advice I would give to anybody who's ever in this situation, and I just kind of stumbled onto it, was after each board meeting, for the first 3 or 4 board meetings, I would have breakfast with the chairman and say, what am I doing right? What am I not doing right? Where am I adding value? Am I talking too much? How can I improve? Right. I was just looking for a feedback loop since this was all relatively new to me. It just was fun. I really liked it. And so I decided to leave Qualcomm. I stayed on the board of Silicon Labs. I joined another private board and I thought, no, maybe I could do this as a next career. I ended up doing GoPro instead for a couple of years. But after GoPro, I decided that this was something I could do full time and I really liked doing. As far as why I pick boards or, why boards might pick me, I would say that my decisions are heavily based on people. So if you go back to Silicon Labs, I knew that CEO. I knew him really well. We had gotten to know each other quite a bit after the failed transaction that we worked on. And we would get together at investor conferences and I knew the way he thought and I felt like I could be really helpful for him. I didn't know others on the board, but I did know the CEO well. So for me, I pick boards based on people, and it is extremely rare that I would join a board. I would say it's very unlikely I would ever join a board where I don't know the people on the board. That could be management, it could be other board members, but one of the things people forget about being on a board is that you're going to be on it for a long time, most likely. And if you have to do that with people you don't really enjoy being around or you're not aligned with, it can be not a great experience. And so I think that the primary thing to focus on is who can you be on that board with? Are you going to learn from them? Can you add value? Will it be a good experience?
Jack, in all the conversations I have the pleasure of hosting here on the podcast, it always comes back to people and relationships, no matter what the topic.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, in the end, we're all humans and we're all trying to get things done. It's a lot easier to get it done with people that you enjoy working with and that are aligned with you.
And what you just told us was two stories that both tie back to people. One was the board selection process that you go through. And the other one was you did something so intelligent, just human, which was in your early days, sitting down for breakfast and saying, what did I do wrong? Give me actual tangible feedback I can take action on.
It's funny because when I was an operator, everybody knew this. When we would do like a QBR, I would sit down with them. I'd tell them your summary slide should lead with the negatives. I want to know what's wrong with what's going on because I can't fix things that are right. I can tell you how great you are and wonderful, good job, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't tell me what needs to be worked on, I can't add value. And so I kind of look at it the same way as a board member. I'm constantly looking for feedback. And I think if you have the right people around you, they're going to be more prone to give you that feedback.
You talked just now about how in the very early days, you said stumbled in was the word you used to your first board role, and the private company roles you had subsequently just after that. You were kind of educating yourself. You mentioned coming to NACD for education. Well, what a long way you've come, because this past year, NACD named you Private Director of the Year, and you've served on many private company boards. So I'm curious, what, in your view, really makes a private company board more unique in terms of your service as a director? What are those nuances that might have surprised you or would surprise a director coming from a different kind of company?
Yeah, I think some of this goes back to when I was trying to establish my quote unquote business model, right? What was it that I was going to do? How would I add value to a public or a private board? And one of the things I decided pretty early on was I'm a growth guy. I've made most of the mistakes you're going to make, sometimes more than once. So where I can add value is going through growth. And so what I did was I ended up talking to a lot of the venture guys in the Valley. And at the time, you didn't have a lot of independent board members. This was back in the 2014, 2015 timeframe. You would have mostly venture-backed boards. There'd be the investors on the board, the founders, they're small boards. But like creating a true board isn't something you're going to do it at like a Series A or a seed round. You might start doing it at a Series B round or Series C round when you're really moving into more growth mode. And so what I tried to do was I went to the venture guys and I said, hey, you know me, I know you. My skill set is financial primarily. I can help you with IPOs. I can help you with M&A. I can be a good member of this board. And I can also be someone who's there when maybe you take the company public and you step down from the board because you're moving on to your next thing. But you know that I'm going to be not aligned with you, but really I'm going to represent values that are important to you. And so I thought that was the right swim lane for me to go down. And that's basically what I did. I found a lot of these companies that were heavy growth, needed to go public or needed to be sold. And, that's when I would step in. So when I would step into that, you usually have no other independent on the board. I'm like that one person in the room that's the independent. It's much different than the public companies where everybody's independent. And so a lot of the work in the early part is really setting up governance, right? It's like, hey guys, you need an audit committee, right? Or you need a comp committee. What's the best practice for doing this? Let's set up charters. I have a whole generic folder of things that I can give to a private company that helps them put these resources and put these systems in place. I think that stuff is actually fun for me, right? It's more hands-on. It's like being an operator without being an operator, because I can work very closely with these guys and the problems that they have. Maybe they have go-to-market problems where I can advise them on. Whereas in a public company, it just tends to be more corporate governance, right? So for me, I feel like I can make a bigger impact, and I wasn't ready to sit on the sidelines. I'm just not that passive person who's going to sit there and be on one board, and that's the thing that gives me my identity. For me, I actually like helping form these companies and getting them through the stages of M&A and IPO and taking them to the next level. So for me, I find the private companies are actually more fun than doing the public companies. I will say the public companies are good. I learn a lot about just more complex governance stuff while I'm doing public companies. And I find that it's actually probably pretty good brand value for me, right? That, I sit on a bunch of companies that of, as opposed to a lot of these private companies. But, in the end, frankly, I think the privates are more fun.
You talked about getting a private off the ground, literally creating charters and committees and, Series A. As a growth guy, I wonder if you can give me your perspective around, as the private company, therefore, will evolve from that first launch, how does the board's role change during that evolution?
Yeah, I think in the early days, it's pretty light governance. If you think about it, you're sitting around a table with a bunch of investors. So maybe it's 2 founders and 2 investors and an independent on that board. Honestly, all decisions can be made in that room. Every investor is effectively sitting in that room. So governance is actually pretty easy in the sense that, you have all the stakeholders sitting around. It's when you're preparing to go public, or even as you're starting to get through M&A, where you need the independents to kind of look and say, my duty is to represent the company. I care about the investors and I care about the people in the company. But my job is to be that person who looks at the fair implementation of whatever is going to be done. And then as you get closer to public, you're just putting in a lot of procedures, and you're getting ready for things like SOX, and you're getting ready for compensation structures that are much different than when you're a private company. So you're just kind of evolving this stuff over time. And I really believe that you need to have multiple independents on a board that can help with this. If, for example, at Tonal, El Catterton is one of the primary investors in Tonal. But we also have 3 really great independents. Myself, my friend Nina Richardson, who worked with me at GoPro and is an operations expert, and my friend Elisa Steele, who's a stud marketing person. And we need all those characteristics sitting around the table, in addition to the investors, when we're a private company and we're trying to grow really rapidly.
So you mentioned some people's names there, and it brings me back to our topic of relationships. And you mentioned taking companies public, so I'll hook my question on that. Either as a CFO or a board member, helped take multiple companies public over your career, what have you observed about the relationship or the dynamics between the board and the CEO, or even other executives in the C-suite, especially during those exits?
And this is where having independent views is actually quite important in my view, because let's say you move to an M&A transaction. The incentives are not always aligned between the employees and the investors. And investors, you're going to have people who generally going to have preferred stock. So they're going to have some level of return that they're looking for on that preferred stock. And they may have preferences where they get paid out before anybody in the common gets paid out. But in the end, I represent the preferred and I represent the common. And so I have to look at what's best for the overall company. It's an important thing to take into account in an M&A transaction. When you're going public, you have a whole separate set of things that you're dealing with. So for example, I commonly deal with things like dual class stock, which I don't particularly care for. I believe that all shareholders should be treated equally when you're a public company. There are situations where I think dual class can make sense. I actually had one company that did do dual class. We had a very long debate about it, and we decided to put a sunset provision in place. And that's how I got satisfied. But in general, there's a lot of these conversations that are just things that have to be had. Dealing with compensation, as I mentioned, it's very different for a public company than for a private company. And so you have to work through the mechanics of getting a compensation consultant and looking at your comps and doing all the things that are going to make you look like what truly a good, well-run public company should look like. So I think there's just a lot of those things that, fortunately, in my case, I think I've done probably 10 IPOs between being an operator and being a board member. So I just have a lot of experience in it. And once again, I've probably made some good mistakes along the way too. So I've learned over the years what I think is best practices. And I think that most founders really want to do the right thing when they're taking their company public. They want to be good stewards for the company, for all public shareholders. And so you just kind of have to work with them on a lot of these topics.
In your answer, you gave a little hint to some of the differences between public and private, and you admitted that you have a lot of fun on the private company boards. So looking at these distinct entities or types of boards, what can public company boards or directors learn? What would be a lesson from private company directorship?
We have a tendency to get almost overly obsessed with governance in a public company. And I don't mean that in a way where I'm trying to talk down the importance of governance, but like too much of a board meeting can be stuck on the things that we just have to do to get through earnings, as opposed to what's really making the company work or not work. For example, one of my companies that was private and went public, we had a bit of a tough time, in the last couple of years. And we had to sit down in a board meeting. I literally got up and said, we think we're doing a great job, but yet the stock's really far down. The company's not performing the way in which it should be. What are we doing wrong? And it ends up, in this case, we decided that there was a significant change that needed to be made in the business. And post that change, the stock has been up probably 1,000%. That was because we actually spent time on the right thing, which was running the business. So I think that's the thing you're doing all the time as a private company. And we probably need to remember that a bit more in public companies sometimes. In a public company, you're going to have some really great leaders that have great experience, but sometimes they just need a kick in the butt. And our job is to sometimes kick them in the butt.
Yeah, as you're talking, it strikes me that it's helpful if every public company thinks about, do we need a certain number or more private company directors on this board to bring that diversity of thinking?
I think that can be very helpful. I think it's experiences that really add the most value. So I don't know that it's a private director, public director. I think it's a director that can just come in and add value. You've just got to identify where the weakness is in a board, because we all have weaknesses. There's things that we need to build on. And I think if you just find the right people and be open-minded that they could come from a private company, I think that's a good thing. I was once a director who had no public company board experience. And yet I learned from the people around me, right? So if you've got a prevalence of public company experience on your board, maybe it's time to get someone who's got kind of a different point of view, and maybe they're sitting in a private company. And I think we should be open-minded to it.
The data has shown recently that more and more companies are going private or deciding to stay private. Why do you think that is?
The reason is clearly there's a lot of money in the private markets. One of the main reasons you go public is to unlock capital. And I think it's very important for the brand of your company, particularly for selling to an enterprise. I think people should grow up. Being public is, I think, a very, very powerful tool in building your business. You'll notice recently there's been some talk about not doing quarterly filings and doing, maybe filings every 6 months. I actually don't believe in that. I think deadlines and milestones are important. And you need to measure yourself on both a short and a long-term basis. There's a great book that I'm sure a lot of people have read. I'm not a big believer in most of these business books. I think it's a lot of people pontificating in many ways. But Good to Great is a fantastic book. Within Good to Great, there is a particular section of the book that's dedicated to something called Stockdale's paradox. If you haven't read it, you should. Stockdale's paradox is basically about Admiral Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war in the Vietnam War for 10 years. He constantly had this belief that he was going to get out, but, he had to deal with his day-to-day reality. And so Stockdale's paradox is basically have an unwavering belief in where you're going, but have the courage to deal with your daily reality. If you're a prisoner of war, you've got to find food. You've got to stay alive today, but you're going to have a belief that you're going to get out at some time. So I think both long and short-term goals are both really important. And I frankly think they make companies better by having both short and long-term goals. And so I think people shouldn't be afraid of going public. I actually think you become better for being a public company, but it's a little bit easier not to go down that path when there's so much private money sitting out there. And I think that's why you're seeing less public companies right now.
What an elegant metaphor to use Stockdale's paradox there. I really hear it in terms of our eyes are on the road. We don't want to crash. And also they're on the horizon.
And I literally had Stockdale's paradox written up on the back of my door when I was an operator to remind me that I've got to do the things to get through today, but I know where we're going. Like when we were building Atheros Communications, so Atheros helped bring you this thing called Wi-Fi, kind of important. Ends up it's a lot bigger market than I thought it was going to be. But we also knew we need to build a diversified company. And so we had to win in Wi-Fi, but we had to build out things like Bluetooth and GPS and other types of networking because that's what our customers wanted. And if we didn't do that, we wouldn't have survived in the long run. These kind of reminders are just important to keep in front of you.
Jack, you just discussed a little bit of history of your background, early days, and you did tell me when we had our planning call the other day that you have a GoPro on your desk from your earliest incarnations, and you keep it there for a very specific reason. And I'm just wondering about what's the biggest thing you've learned from a mistake you've made along your journey?
So let's be very clear. I've made lots of mistakes. So this would just be one of them. I'm actually holding the GoPro in my hand right now because it does sit on my desk. You may remember GoPro was kind of the thing everybody was talking about in 2014. We were everywhere. I would travel. I'd turn on CNN. There'd be stories about GoPro. We were growing so fast. I got there, it was a $500 million company. We got up to about $1.5 billion. And we would launch new products every year. And one product we launched was a product called Session, which didn't quite go the way in which we had anticipated. I thought it was a great product. I made some pricing decisions that were probably not real smart, where we priced it a little bit too high. We made some launch decisions. We launched it at the wrong time. Ends up people don't like to buy consumer electronics around July 4th. They would prefer to do it closer to the holidays. There were just a lot of lessons that I learned from it. And in my way of reminding myself of constantly being in a learning mode is to keep this thing on my desk and to remember what went right. But the product was a good product, but we didn't position it correctly. We didn't price it correctly. We made just a ton of mistakes along the way. We had to clean it up and move on, but it made a bad impact on GoPro back in the day. I think it's important to fail on things like this, but try not to do it multiple times. That's my general goal.
Well, you told us about a sign you put on the back of your door as an operator years ago and an ancient GoPro you've got on your desk. So I wonder if this is an invitation to our listeners to think about what reminder and physical talisman, as it were, they want to keep to remember where they're going and where they don't want to make a mistake again.
And we should all think about it. We all have a series of things we haven't done right in our careers. And I think people can learn from that. And I think that's one of the values of having board members is that we can help you with those types of things. But at the same time, let's remember the things we do really well. A lot of the success in a company is around hiring the right people and having the right people around the table and having people aligned. And I think boards are really critical to making sure that that's in place too. I can point to really great people that I worked with over the years, and none of what any of my companies did would have been done without a strong set of people around the table. And I think it's important to identify those things that really work over and over again too.
Well, there we go, hooking it back to people, which is just such an important theme. And I'm so glad you're the person that we had on this podcast today, Jack. Thank you so much for sharing your great insights. It was a delight chatting with you.
Oh, it was a complete pleasure. And like I said, I really, really am happy that you guys are doing programs like this because I would have killed to have this when I was just starting out on the board side. I feel very blessed to be able to have an impact on my companies, and I really enjoy working with them, and I think I'm a pretty lucky guy.
Amazing. I think we're lucky. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Susan.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.